It starts with a line that almost feels wrong, the kind that makes you freeze for a second and wonder what's really going on. And honestly, that's exactly why I kept listening. As a viewer, I love when a story opens with something that twists my expectations right from the first breath. It pulls me in, grabs my attention, and makes me lean closer, waiting for the truth behind the words. But what surprised me the most wasn't the line itself. It was how quickly my assumptions fell apart. The moment I heard it, I thought I knew where the story was heading. I thought it was going to be one of those situations where someone says something wild, and everything turns messy. But then the narrator shifted the mood so gently, almost like guiding me from shock into curiosity. And now I couldn't help but wonder who this girl was, why she sounded desperate, and what made the rancher hesitate before helping her. There's something powerful about stories like this. The ones that catch you off guard, not because they're loud or dramatic, but because they're unexpected. One moment you think you understand everything. The next, you realize you know nothing at all. And that little gap between what you assume and what's real, that's where the tension grows. So I stayed. I kept listening. Because I could feel it, something deeper was hiding behind that strange request. Something that connected a frightened girl, a quiet ranch, and a man who had no idea how much trouble was about to step into his life. He wasn't the kind of man who went looking for trouble. In fact, if you asked anyone who lived within 50 miles, they'd tell you the same thing. The rancher preferred silence over noise, distance over crowds, and routine over surprises. His life was simple, and he liked it that way. He woke before sunrise, fed the horses, checked the fences, and worked the land until the sky turned orange again. No phone buzzing every 5 minutes, no visitors knocking on his door, no drama pulling him into problems that weren't his. And honestly, as a viewer who loves getting lost in a good story, this quiet beginning pulled me in more than any dramatic explosion could. There's something oddly comforting about meeting a character whose world is steady and calm. It makes you relax for a moment, makes you trust the space you're in. It's almost like the story lets you breathe before it starts tightening the tension around you. And with this man, this calm felt especially strong. I could picture him moving through his day without hurry. His boots always found the same paths through the dirt. His hands knew every tool in the barn without needing to look. He spoke mostly to the animals, and even then, just a few words at a time. The horses understood him better than most people did. He didn't need much from the world, and the world didn't ask much from him. That balance seemed perfect. But stories don't stay perfect for long. The ranch itself had a kind of stillness that I, as a listener, could almost feel. The wide fields stretched into the distance, untouched except for the footprints of cattle and the wind brushing over tall grass. Some days were so quiet he could hear the creaking of old wooden boards on the porch, or the distant cry of a hawk gliding through the sky. That silence wasn't empty. It was peaceful. It was the kind of silence that belonged to someone who had made peace with being alone. He didn't have family dropping by. He didn't have neighbors coming over for coffee. The nearest house was miles away, and most folks only passed the area when they were lost or in a hurry to get somewhere else. But he didn't mind. He wasn't running from anyone or hiding from anything. He simply liked knowing that each day would be predictable, familiar, and completely under his control. And that's what made what happened next so gripping for me as the viewer. Because when a man builds a life around stillness, the smallest ripple becomes impossible to ignore. And the day everything changed didn't begin with thunder or shouts or chaos. It started with something much softer, something the rancher almost overlooked. He noticed it while checking the fence line on the west side of the property. At first, it looked like a piece of fabric stuck on a barbed wire twist, a bit of color out of place in the endless brown and green. He might have ignored it if not for the way it moved, a faint flutter, as if touched by a breeze that didn't reach him. He rode closer, expecting to see a scrap blown in from the road. But when he leaned down to take it, he realized it wasn't fabric at all. It was the edge of a sleeve, and the arm wearing it was trembling. Even before he saw the face, he knew something was terribly wrong. The body lying in the shade wasn't moving much, just small, weak breaths pushing the chest up and down. The dust around her shoes showed dragged footprints. Someone had walked far too far, with no water, no supplies, and maybe no hope left. As a viewer, this is the moment my attention sharpened. Something about the contrast hits hard. One minute we're inside the slow rhythm of ranch life. The next we're staring at a stranger on the ground, and our mind races with questions. Who is she? How did she get there? Why this ranch of all places? The rancher wasn't the emotional type, but even he couldn't ignore the sight. He knelt beside her, gently turning her onto her back. Her face was pale, lips cracked, eyes barely open. She didn't look dangerous. She didn't look like someone running a trick or setting a trap. She looked like someone who had been fighting the sun for too long and had almost lost. He reached for his canteen instinctively. But before he could lift it, her fingers moved, shaking, desperate, and she whispered something he didn't quite catch. He leaned in closer, thinking she was trying to say her name. Instead, he heard that strange, breathless plea. Even here, before the story reveals anything else, I could feel the shift. The rancher's quiet world was no longer untouched. A stranger lying on his land meant responsibility, mystery, and danger he had never planned for. And for someone who had lived years without surprises, this one arrived like a wildfire sparked from a single, unexpected ember. He didn't know yet what helping her would cost him. He didn't know what kind of past she carried or what kind of men were following her. To him, she was just a girl who needed water. And to me, she was the moment the story finally opened the door to something much bigger, something neither of us was prepared for. But even then, even as he lifted her into his arms to take her back to the house, I could sense it. This wasn't just a rescue. This wasn't just kindness. This was the beginning of the moment where a quiet, predictable life meets the kind of trouble that doesn't stay outside for long. And once it walks in, nothing is ever the same again. He carried her inside like she weighed nothing, though every step felt heavier than the last. The house was small, built with his own hands years ago, but it had everything she needed: shade, water, and a clean place to rest. He laid her on the old couch near the window, the one spot where the late afternoon light fell soft instead of harsh. Her breathing was shallow, almost silent, like each inhale was a decision her body wasn't sure it wanted to make. I found myself leaning closer as I listened, because something about her presence felt out of place in his quiet world. She didn't belong to the dust or the wind or the open fields the way he did. She looked like someone who came from somewhere far more complicated, somewhere crowded, somewhere loud. And yet here she was, collapsed in the middle of a ranch owned by a man who avoided anything that could pull him into someone else's chaos. He brought a bowl of water and a cloth, kneeling beside her again. When he touched the cloth to her forehead, she flinched as if even kindness hurt. Her lips parted, trying to speak, but no words came, just a breath, thin and shaky. He didn't rush her. He wasn't good with people, but he understood fear. He understood exhaustion. So he waited, letting her gather whatever strength she had left. When her eyes finally opened, they struggled to focus. She blinked at the ceiling first, then at the window, and only then at him. There was no recognition in her face, just confusion. Confusion mixed with something deeper, relief, maybe, or desperation pushed down so far that it barely showed. He lifted the spoon toward her, the one he had filled with water. Her hand rose weakly, trembling like a leaf caught between wind and gravity. And then came the words, broken but clear enough to stop him in his tracks. "Put it in my mouth." As a viewer, I couldn't help the way those words hit me. Not because of how they sounded at first, but because of how innocent they truly were when you saw her condition. She wasn't being bold or strange. She wasn't trying to act dramatic. She was simply too weak to lift the spoon herself, too drained to hold the cup, too dehydrated to swallow without help. The rancher hesitated for a moment, not because he misunderstood, but because he wasn't used to being needed like this. His life didn't make room for vulnerability, his or anyone else's. But seeing her cracked lips and hollow eyes, He finally guided the spoon carefully to her mouth. She drank slowly, each sip a shaky victory against whatever she had endured out there. Even as she drank, she kept her eyes on him. Not in fear, but in a strange, silent way that made it clear she was trying to decide whether he was safe. Whether this ranch, this stranger, this little pocket of calm could be trusted. I could feel that tension, quiet, fragile, unspoken, like it hung in the air between them. The more water she drank, the clearer her breathing became. She wasn't better, not by a long shot, but she was no longer fading into unconsciousness. Her voice returned first, barely more than a whisper. She asked where she was. He told her. She asked the date. He told her that too. When she tried to sit up, he put a steady hand on her shoulder, telling her to rest. She didn't argue, which said more than her words ever could. She wasn't just tired. She was worn out from something bigger than a long walk under the sun. Hours passed like that, small sips of water, long moments of silence, the slow reappearance of color in her face. All the while he stayed nearby, not speaking unless she asked him something. That was the kind of man he was. Quiet, patient, grounded. The kind of man who offered help without demanding explanations. But I could sense his curiosity building, even if he didn't show it. He wanted to know who she was, why she was alone, why she had collapsed on his land instead of reaching any of the roads or towns miles away. Eventually, as the shadows from the window stretched longer, she spoke again. This time her voice was steadier. She asked for food. Not much, just a little. Something soft. Something she could keep down. He warmed a bit of soup, and just like before, she needed help lifting it to her lips. Her hands were still trembling, still recovering from dehydration, hunger, and something deeper that none of us understood yet. As she ate, she watched the door more than she watched him. Every creak of the wooden floor seemed to make her flinch. Every gust of wind rattling the windows made her breath catch for a second. It wasn't the house that scared her. It wasn't the ranch. It was something, or someone behind her, somewhere she had come from. Something that had chased her far enough for her body to give out just a few feet from a stranger's fence. The rancher saw it too, though he didn't mention it. He didn't pry. But even without questions, his eyes carried concern. Concern mixed with a quiet readiness, the kind of readiness men develop from years of living alone in places where trouble arrives without warning. The more she recovered, the more that tension grew. She had something to say, something she was holding back, something important enough to make her hands shake even after drinking water and eating food. And I could feel myself leaning even closer now, waiting, anticipating that moment when her story would finally break the surface. Because whatever had driven her into the middle of the rancher's land wasn't small or simple. And the moment she told him the truth, the rancher's quiet world would begin to unravel piece by piece. He stayed close enough to help her, but far enough to give her space. That was how he treated most people, careful, measured, like someone who understood how easily humans could unsettle the balance of a quiet life. But with her, that distance felt thinner, almost invisible. Not because he wanted it that way, but because the situation demanded it. She needed him, even if she didn't want to admit it. She was awake now, sitting up with a blanket pulled over her shoulders. The soup had given her a bit of strength, but not enough to hide how weak she still was. Her hands shook every time she tried to lift the cup. Her breathing steadied only when she pressed her palm against her chest, as if holding herself together. And her eyes, those eyes, watched everything. The windows, the door, the corners of the room, the shadows moving on the walls. She didn't look like someone resting. She looked like someone waiting. The rancher noticed. Of course he did. A man who lives alone notices the smallest shifts in the air, the slightest changes in a person's face. He saw the way her shoulders tensed every time the wind pushed against the house. He heard the tiny gasp she let out when a loose shutter banged against the wall. Something had trained her to react to sound like that. Something had conditioned her to listen for footsteps that might never actually come. He gave her more water, slow and careful, watching her hands tremble even as she tried to steady them. She whispered a small thank you, barely audible. Her voice, though weak, carried weight, like there were words trapped behind it, words she wasn't ready to release. He didn't push. That wasn't his way. He believed that truth came out when it was ready, and forcing it only made it hide deeper. So he waited. Not because he was patient, but because something told him that whatever she was hiding was bigger than anything he had dealt with before. As she rested, he watched her eyes drift to the window again. The sun was sinking low, painting the horizon in deep orange and fading gold. But instead of admiring the view, she swallowed hard and looked away, almost shrinking into herself. "Is someone looking for you?" he asked quietly. She froze. Not dramatically, not with a gasp or a sharp movement. She froze in the way someone does when they've been living on edge for too long. Tight breath, tightened fingers, tightened jaw. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she closed her eyes, gathering her courage one slow inhale at a time. And when she finally spoke, her voice trembled with fear and exhaustion. "They'll come," she whispered. "Not maybe, not if, they'll come." As a viewer, that line hit me like a cold gust. It wasn't panic, it was certainty. She wasn't speculating, she was warning him. He didn't flinch, but something shifted in his expression. A quiet readiness, a settling of invisible weight on his shoulders. Not fear, not surprise, just acceptance. The kind of acceptance a man has when he knows something dangerous is approaching and he can't simply walk away from it. He pulled a chair closer and sat down, not looming over her but not stepping back either. "Who?" he asked gently. She looked at her hands instead of his face. "People I shouldn't have trusted." Her voice cracked. "People who don't forgive." The rancher nodded slowly. He didn't judge her. He didn't question her decisions. He just let her speak at her own pace. She continued, barely lifting her gaze. "I thought I could run far enough. I thought I could disappear." Her eyes flicked toward the door again, as if imagining shadows gathering on the other side. "But they're not the kind to give up." There was another pause, one thick enough that even I felt it through the narration. It was the kind of silence that isn't empty. It's full of meaning, full of unsaid things. She touched her wrist absent-mindedly, tracing a faint mark hidden under the sleeve. A mark the rancher noticed but didn't comment on. She caught the movement of his eyes and tugged the blanket higher, hiding it again. He didn't ask more. Not yet. But her mind was spinning too fast, too frightened to keep everything inside. "I didn't mean to bring danger here," she said, voice breaking. "I didn't know where else to go. I wasn't even trying to reach your ranch. I couldn't walk anymore." A shaky breath escaped her lips. "I'm sorry." The rancher's expression softened, not with pity but with understanding. "You're safe for now," he said. "Rest." And even though his voice was calm, the words carried a quiet promise, the kind that came naturally to men who didn't talk much but meant everything they said. But inside, something in him stirred. Not fear, but awareness. He had lived long enough to know that danger doesn't announce itself politely. It arrives quietly at first. It tests the air. It moves through the grass. And then, when the sun goes down, it steps onto your land and decides whether it wants to stay. She must have sensed that too, because she finally lifted her eyes to meet his. "You don't understand," she whispered. "They're not going to stop." Her voice grew softer, shaking. "They think I belong to them. They think I ran away from something they own." The rancher's jaw tightened, just barely. A tiny shift, but enough for me as the listener to feel the change inside him. He didn't like the sound of that. He didn't like the idea of anyone claiming ownership over another human being. Her next words were even quieter. "And now that you helped me, they'll see you as part of it." That admission hung heavy in the air, dense enough that even the room felt smaller. This was no accident, no coincidence, no random girl lost in the wilderness. Something bigger had arrived at his doorstep. Something dangerous, something relentless. And by offering her water, by lifting her into his home, by giving her a place to breathe, he had unknowingly stepped across an invisible line. A line that separated the peaceful life he built from the storm that was already coming for him. The house grew quieter as evening settled in, but the silence didn't feel the same anymore. It wasn't peaceful, not like before. It felt tight, heavy, like the air was waiting for something to happen. The rancher sensed it first. Years of living alone had sharpened his instincts. He could feel shifts before he understood them. And now, every breath the girl took, every glance she cast toward the window, deepened the tension that wrapped itself around the room. She was stronger now, strong enough to sit without trembling, but not strong enough to hide the fear rooted deep inside her. Her fingers picked at the edge of the blanket. Her knee bounced restlessly. She kept pushing her hair behind her ear only for it to fall forward again. These weren't habits. They were symptoms, signs that her mind was still running long after her body had stopped. The rancher leaned against the counter, arms crossed loosely, watching her without pressing. He didn't know her story, not fully, but he understood that she hadn't told him even half of it yet. And honestly, as a viewer, this moment tightened my attention. It felt like the story had been walking quietly, step by step, toward a truth that couldn't be avoided anymore. She looked toward the door again. "Can you hear them?" she whispered suddenly. The rancher straightened up. "Hear who?" She swallowed, her eyes unfocused for a moment. "I keep thinking they're here. Every sound it feels like footsteps." He listened, truly listened. Outside there was nothing but the slow groan of the wind and the distant rustle of dry brush. "There's no one out there," he said calmly. "Not yet." The yet slipped out naturally. It wasn't meant to scare her. It was the truth his gut had already accepted, and she heard it. Her shoulders stiffened, but she didn't deny it. She pulled the blanket tighter around her. "You don't know them," she said, voice barely steady. "You don't know what they can do." "Then tell me," he replied. She hesitated, not from refusal, but from the weight of remembering. She looked out the window again, watching the fading colors of sunset stretch long shadows across the yard. "I thought I could leave quietly," she began. "I thought that if I ran fast enough, far enough, they'd think I died out there." She shook her head. "But they have people everywhere. They watch the roads, they follow trails. They trace footprints in the dirt like hunters." The rancher didn't interrupt. He just shifted slightly closer so she didn't have to speak across the room. She drew in a shaky breath. "They took me in when I had nowhere else to go. That's how they work. They find people who are desperate, lost, alone. They give you safety at first, a bed, food, a sense of belonging." Her voice grew bitter. "Then they start taking pieces of you, slowly, quietly, until one day you realize you're trapped." She paused to rub her wrists, unconsciously touching the spot she'd hidden earlier. "I didn't belong to them," she said softly, "but they believed I did." The rancher's jaw clenched. He'd heard enough of the world to know exactly what she meant. Not the specifics, not yet, but the shape of the danger was becoming clear. She continued. "I waited months before trying to escape. I planned everything. The time, the route, the supplies." A humorless laugh slipped out. "But I didn't get far. They noticed faster than I expected. They chased me for miles. I hid in the trees, crawled through the brush, and kept going until my legs wouldn't move anymore." Her voice dropped. "They don't let anyone leave. Not alive." A cold awareness settled into the rancher's expression. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This wasn't a lost traveler with a vague problem. This was a target, a hunted one, and by helping her, he had stepped directly into the line of fire. She wrapped her arms around herself. "When you found me, they were behind me. Maybe a mile, maybe less. I kept hearing them. I kept thinking I could feel them getting closer." Her lips pressed together. "And I know them. They won't stop. Not until they get me back. And anyone in the way," she shook her head. "They won't hesitate." The rancher thought for a moment before asking, "How many?" "3," she whispered. "Maybe 4. Men who know the land well enough to move without being seen." He nodded slowly. That explained why she kept watching the windows, why she startled at every creak, why she carried the kind of fear that didn't fade with rest. "They're probably already on your property," she said. Her voice carried no drama, just certainty. "They track quietly. They move fast. If they saw my trail near your fence, they'd spread out and search everything." The rancher didn't like the sound of that. He had miles of open land, but also places where someone could hide, near the barn, behind the hay stacks, in the grove of trees to the east. His mind began mapping the terrain automatically, marking possible entry points, places where shadows could linger unseen. The girl watched him, reading his silence. "You don't have to help me," she whispered. "You can tell me to leave. I don't want to drag you into this." He looked at her, steady and calm, and said nothing for a long moment. But silence can speak louder than words, and his silence told me everything as the listener. He wasn't going to turn his back on her. Not now. Not when she was barely able to stand. Not when danger was already creeping close. And she saw the answer in his eyes before he even spoke. But before she could say anything, something outside made her freeze. Not a loud noise, not a scream, just a faint crunch of gravel so soft it might have been a shifting wind. Her eyes widened. Her breath stopped. She stared toward the window, trembling. "They found me," she whispered. And in that moment the rancher realized the storm she'd brought with her wasn't coming. It was already here. The sound was soft, so soft that anyone else might have ignored it. But the rancher heard it. She heard it. And the air inside the small room changed instantly. It tightened, sharpened, as if the walls themselves understood what that single crunch of gravel meant. Danger wasn't approaching. It had already stepped onto the property. The girl's breathing grew quick, shaky, almost silent but trembling in her chest. She pressed her back against the couch, pulling the blanket tighter around her like it was the only shield she had left. Her eyes fixed on the window, unblinking, terrified in a way that came from memory, not imagination. You could tell she'd heard this sound before, footsteps disguised as wind, movement hidden under silence. The rancher didn't panic. Panic was useless out here. Instead, he straightened slowly, feeling every old instinct he hadn't used in years wake up like they'd been waiting for this moment. He moved to the corner of the room and picked up the rifle that leaned against the wall. He didn't lift it aggressively. He didn't charge to the door. He simply held it with the ease of someone who knew how to protect what was his. He walked to the window and lifted the curtain just enough to see the yard. The sun had fallen low now, leaving long shadows crawling across the dirt. At first, everything looked normal. The barn stood still. The horses were calm. The wind brushed gently through the grass. But the rancher didn't focus on the open spaces. He looked for the dark spots, the places where someone could hide. And then he saw it. A silhouette near the far end of the fence line, too still to be an animal, too deliberate to be an accident. A man crouched low, half hidden behind the old wooden planks. He wasn't moving toward the house yet. He was watching it, studying it, measuring it. The rancher let the curtain fall back into place. "They're here," she whispered, voice thin, cracking like dry leaves. He nodded once. He didn't sugarcoat it. He didn't lie. He didn't tell her everything would be fine. He respected her too much for that. She had lived through enough false promises. Instead, he said what she needed to hear. "Stay low, stay quiet." Her eyes met his wide, terrified, but trusting him in the smallest, most desperate way. He went to the door and locked it. Not because the lock would stop determined men, but because locks bought time. And time was the one thing he needed if he was going to protect her. Outside, faint footsteps shifted again, this time closer. Slow, patient, deliberate. These weren't men who crashed in with noise. These were trackers, hunters, people who moved with purpose. Another sound followed, a small metallic click, the unmistakable sound of a weapon being checked. As a listener, I felt the tension coil tighter. You could sense the weight of everything that was about to unfold pressing against the walls. The rancher blew out a slow breath and moved back toward the girl. "Is there another way out?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "A back door, a window?" He shook his head. "They'd expect that. They're probably covering every exit." Her fear deepened, but she nodded. She understood the game too well. She'd played it before. She'd lost too much already. A shadow passed by the window, just a blur, but enough for her to gasp softly and press a hand over her mouth. The rancher lowered himself beside her, not touching her, but close enough for her to feel that she wasn't alone. "They won't leave," she whispered. "Not until they get what they came for." "I know," he said. It wasn't resignation. It was readiness. Another crunch of gravel came, then another. The men were spreading out, tightening their circle around the home like wolves closing in on a wounded animal. The rancher stood and stepped toward the middle of the room. His posture changed. His breathing steadied. He wasn't just a quiet man anymore. He was a barrier, a shield, a wall between her and everything waiting outside. She watched him, her expression torn between gratitude and guilt. "I never meant for this," she said, voice barely audible. "You don't owe me anything." He looked at her with an expression that was simple and solid. "You were dying, I helped. That doesn't change just because trouble followed." Her eyes welled with tears, not from fear, but from the shock of someone choosing to stand with her when every other door in her life had slammed shut. A sudden thud hit the side of the house. Then another, not knocks, tests. They were checking the structure, looking for weak spots. The rancher lifted the rifle and clicked the safety off. The sound was soft, but it echoed in the room like a promise. The girl swallowed hard. "If they take me," she whispered, "they'll kill you." He didn't look away from the door. "Then they won't take you." She closed her eyes for a moment, letting those words settle into the deepest parts of her fear. Outside, footsteps shifted again, fast this time, urgent. The men were no longer hiding, they were positioning. One voice spoke, muffled but clear enough to send a shiver through her spine. "Inside, we know you're in there." The rancher didn't respond. He didn't open the door. He didn't give them the satisfaction of acknowledgement. Another voice followed. "Give the girl up, walk away, that's your only chance." She trembled beside the couch, her breath uneven and fragile. She remembered those voices. She remembered what they were capable of. The rancher kept his eyes on the door, grounded and steady. The house seemed to hold its breath. The girl inched closer to the wall, curling inward, bracing for what she'd spent weeks running from. Outside, boots crunched in the dirt. Then a hand hit the door hard. And as the echo rippled through the small room, the rancher tightened his grip on the rifle. The price of helping her had finally arrived on his doorstep. And the night wasn't done taking.